I was at a tech investor conference at Mar-a-Lago actually a couple months ago. And like I was sitting around a table with a bunch of investors, mostly from like family offices, and they were they were like, I can't believe what China is doing. Like we're absolutely, falling behind. And the more people hear about what China's actually doing in nuclear, the more urgent it becomes. I mean, people say like we're falling behind. We're so far behind already. It's like hard to describe.
Welcome back to the Middle Tech Podcast. You got Logan Jones here, and today's episode is a bit different than what you might be used to hearing on Middle Tech's feed. So rather than highlighting a founder or a startup or an innovator building in Kentucky, today I wanted to bring on an industry expert in a field that I believe is going to play a big role in Kentucky's future over the coming decades. And that is in the energy sector, and more specifically in nuclear energy. So Kentucky has recently established the Kentucky Nuclear Energy Development Authority, essentially communicating out that Kentucky is open for business as far as nuclear energy is concerned. And I believe this is very timely as we see this momentum and the tide shift around energy, and really putting an emphasis on bringing as much energy onto the grid in America as possible, as we think about trying to maintain dominance in the artificial intelligence space, bring manufacturing back to America, the electrification of our transportation ecosystem, and also just the economic growth that comes from all of those different things. And so because I'm just generally interested and curious about the energy sector, I wanted to start bringing on people who are thought leaders in that space. More specifically, I'm very interested and curious about nuclear energy and the role that could play in our energy future here in the state of Kentucky. So today I'm joined by Dr. Nick Touran, who is a nuclear engineer, a consultant, and educator who has dedicated his career to making nuclear energy more understandable and accessible. He's the founder of What is Nuclear, a go-to resource that helps people understand nuclear at any level, serving industry experts, investors, governments, and the general public. And actually a funny anecdote, whatisnuclear.com was the website that helped me first learn about nuclear about 4 years ago when I first became interested in the space. So that's where I went down the rabbit hole, so to speak, about nuclear energy. Nick also spent 16 years at TerraPower, which is the Bill Gates-backed advanced reactor company where he worked directly on designing next-generation reactors. Beyond his technical expertise, he's a thought leader in the nuclear industry, an advocate for innovation in energy, and an author. If you're interested in nuclear, I highly recommend following his account on X at whatisnuclear. He posts all sorts of awesome history about the space and his thoughts on where the space is headed. So I hope you learned something from this conversation. I know I did. I really enjoyed it. And I'll be excited to kind of track where the space goes as far as Kentucky is concerned. So before we jump into this conversation, I just want to get a quick word from the sponsors that make Middle Tech possible. Before we highlight our sponsors, we'd just like to state that the views and content shared on this platform do not necessarily reflect those of our show sponsors. That being said, Middle Tech is supported by KY Innovation, the Kentucky Cabinet for Economic Development's Office of Entrepreneurship. KY Innovation exists to support and develop Kentucky's startup ecosystem, and we are proud to be supported by an organization whose mission aligns so closely with ours. If you are a founder building in Kentucky, you need to check out the resources that KY Innovation has to offer. You can find more information by clicking the link in our show notes or going to kyinnovation.com. All right, Nick. So you've dedicated your entire career not only to building advanced nuclear reactors at TerraPower, but also to educating people about nuclear energy and just being an advocate for the technology, which I'd really call passion. I'm curious how that passion developed. Where did that come from?
It came from as I learned about nuclear, I became really excited and interested in it, and I felt like it was kind of an underdog, and so that sort of gave me more passion to get out there and tell people about it. And it was interesting because a lot of people have this preconceived notion about nuclear power where they don't really know that much about it, but they don't like it. It's bad for various reasons. But when you get into a conversation with somebody and tell them and kind of go through the various things that they might initially be concerned about, there's pretty high likelihood or pretty high prevalence of people being like, oh, okay, I didn't know that. Like, tell me more, or like, let me hear more. And so it's very rewarding. It's kind of interesting. I think it's very impactful. It's important for civilization. And so, yeah, there's just a lot of elements there that make it interesting to me and give me a lot of passion just talking about it.
Yeah, I think it's been about 4 years since I really just kind of went down the nuclear rabbit hole. We were talking on the phone when we were discussing recording an episode, and I was like, I feel like I'm talking to a celebrity because your resource, whatisnuclear.com, that was where I went down the rabbit hole, which I just think it's
Nice.
so cool, the kind of your approach to educating around nuclear and being an advocate for the space. But we'll get to that here in a second. I also want to hear a little bit about TerraPower. So you spent 16 years helping design and build advanced reactors. Would love to know just, like what did your day-to-day look like at TerraPower, and what kind of work were you responsible for while you were there?
Yeah, it really varied. Like when I showed up, I was a grad student, and there were like 10 people at the company, and it was very much like cutting edge, very secretive, very like we are
Mhm.
doing this. It was called a traveling wave reactor was the main project back then. It's funded by Bill Gates. It was very kind of fancy and exciting. I didn't quite know what to expect, but I just happened to be doing research in the type of reactor that they were interested in. So that's how I got involved. The day to day back then was like almost like it was staying up late, like running computer simulations of the reactor where we would be moving the fuel around and running simulations to see how the reactor would perform. And it was like very competitive because there was another guy, it's like an old national lab guy who had all these awards, and he was running a different code to simulate the fuel moving around and the neutrons. And like I was kind of in a head to head with him where I would try to get the fuel to move best, and then he would try to get it move best, and we would present it in front of the whole company, like the whole company, which was again 10 people. We'd get together and argue about which fuel management was best. And that went on for some time. But eventually, the team grew, and we started adding, like it became a lot of, it actually became kind of a software development project because while we're
Mm.
focused on simulating that reactor before we build it so we get it just right. Well, we have to add more and more fidelity to the simulation to make sure that we're considering all the different design elements of the reactor. So we started adding simulations for the temperature and the flow and the pressure and all the different mechanical gradients and the chemistry going on inside the fuel. There's all sorts of interesting physics in a nuclear reactor. We built a team. I ended up kind of doing, like software project management with a bunch of nuclear mechanical engineers writing that software that could run those simulations. So it was very much like run the simulation, build the simulation, like write the code, design the
Mhm.
reactor, kind of hand in hand. That was quite interesting. Anyway, what parts of those do you want to hear more about?
Yeah, well, I think it'd be helpful for the audience to understand, exactly what it means to be building a quote unquote advanced
Yeah,
reactor. So, based off the research I did, I believe it was called a natrium reactor or a molten salt cooled reactor. So maybe just giving us like the really high level on what that design entails and how that differs from a traditional reactor.
sure. So yeah, and the term advanced reactor is very sort of nuanced and complicated, but we'll just talk
Hmm.
about the TerraPower product where I used to work. So so natrium is it's actually this is super confusing because it's not actually salt cooled, it's sodium cooled, but sodium, elemental sodium, is a liquid metal closer to like mercury than a molten
Oh
salt.
wow.
Very confusingly, natrium also has molten salt over by the steam turbine outside of the reactor where it's more like sodium chloride. So it transfers heat from a liquid metal, sodium, to a molten salt, and there's an energy storage system involved on the molten salt side. So it's almost impossible to explain because like those things all get, those are very easy to sort of get wrapped up. But anyway, um, most reactors we have running today are cooled with water, pressurized water, boiling water. Um, there are many other types of reactors that you can build. Millions of different types of reactors have different types of fuel, different coolant, different material to slow the neutrons down. We call it a moderator. And all the different
Hmm.
types of reactors may or may not have different characteristics that are better or worse than the current generation fleet of reactors. So the idea behind natrium, it uses sodium liquid metal coolant, and that's been done before. I mean, we built a sodium cooled reactor in the early 50s, for instance, and we've built about a dozen of them around the world since then. They never really got totally commercialized. Only Russia has one running commercially at this point, but they've been a very small minority of all the reactors in the world. But they have really interesting capabilities, which is what makes things like natrium and other sodium cooled reactors interesting. One capability is that if you use liquid metal coolant, it's a very good coolant. It's a liquid metal after all, so it can like conduct and carry heat away really well. it doesn't become high pressure. So when you do a water-cooled reactor, you have it under like 2000 psi, very high pressure with big, thick pipes and big, thick vessels. And if there's a leak in a valve or something, all that water can come like shooting out. And you have to work really hard to keep the core cool if there's a leak. Whereas with a liquid metal, if there's, well, since it's not pressurized, there isn't really a motive force. That thing, if there's a power outage or something like what happened at Fukushima, the liquid metal can just naturally circulate and carry the heat away from the reactor without any backup diesel generators or diesel or pumps or anything like that. So there's a safety advantage in that regard. They can go to higher temperature. So when you make heat at a higher temperature, you can convert a higher fraction of it to electricity. So it has a higher thermal efficiency. That gives you more bang for your buck. It's basically the miles per gallon of a reactor. So that's very good. And then most of the interest in these sodium cooled systems has been you can do something pretty weird sounding called breeding. You can breed more fuel. And all it really means is should be called like unlocking fuel from the resource. You basically can get 200 times more energy out of the uranium that you dig up out of the ground than you would get out of a normal reactor. So it has this very like really long-term, large-scale capability, like run the planet for, millions of years off known amounts of uranium. So it's this really long-term sustainability thing. And there's a couple other advantages. There's also downsides, right? Liquid metal sodium, everyone kind of knows that if you like throw it in water, it like reacts. There's a big chemical reaction.
Right.
So you do have to deal with keeping it separate from water and air and concrete and all those things. So there's a bunch of special things, double-walled pipes and special instrumentation and so on, and purification systems that you have to deal with in order to get those advantages. But that's the idea. So it's like you work harder, you put in more complex technology, and it gives you potentially better capability. So that's the basic idea there. I should mention, and then, sorry.
No, you're good. This is super interesting.
Yeah, so then that's just a normal sodium cooled fast reactor that we've built lots of. Natrium from TerraPower in particular is that, but then instead of going straight to a sodium to water steam generator, which would just go off and make steam, there's an extra loop, like a third loop. It goes like sodium to sodium and then to this molten salt, which is what you're referring to at first. And that goes into these huge tanks of, one's hot and one's cold salt tanks. And that's a thermal energy storage system. So, and then that thing goes to an actual steam generator, which is hooked to a turbine, which can make electricity. But the idea, by putting that big thermal energy storage system thing in there, which was proposed, this was invented in the 70s, 1976. But it was never built back then. TerraPower's building it now in Wyoming. The idea there is that if you're in the United States and there's a lot of wind, a lot of solar, because those have gotten cheap to build, when the wind's blowing and the sun's shining, they're super cheap. When they're not, they're not. So if you have something that can really ramp up very quickly to fill in, as the wind dies down, or if the sun goes under a cloud or whatever, that could integrate really well with the American dynamics of like what's going on in the grid. So this salt storage system thing can basically store a couple, several hours of electricity. The reactor stays at full power all the time, but the actual electricity being generated can be varied very rapidly, 12% full power per minute or something like that, just by changing how much of the heat is being brought from the hot salt tank into the cold salt tank. So it's kind of a hybrid thing there. And then there's also a shtick where, well, because you've like totally separated the steam turbine from the nuclear plant, you can like have those be totally separate construction projects and maybe get some construction quality assurance type efficiencies that you could do with other types of reactors, but kind of complicated. Sometimes if you like order some bolts and that bolt could be put in the commercial grade and the nuclear grade place, it's best to just get them all nuclear grade because you don't want to accidentally put a non-nuclear grade bolt in the nuclear thing and then have to go figure out which one it was later. So there's some advantages of kind of having those as separate construction projects. And then last thing, TerraPower also has a full-on molten salt reactor project. It's a much smaller project. It's a different product. It's called the MCFR, the molten chloride fast reactor. And that's like a totally separate project where TerraPower is building a very small, something called a reactor experiment at Idaho National Lab to kind of prove that out. And that's like a slightly more futuristic reactor that's coming along as well. That's that story.
Super cool. Well, yeah, I mean, there's just so much.
Hmm.
Well, one, there's so much that I'm not even aware of that
Yeah,
exists in kind of the technological innovations that happen in the space. But
yeah,
we'll get into this as well. All
yeah.
the regulation that kind of comes
Mhm.
along with trying to get new reactors approved, obviously, is like when you think, okay, well, why don't we build all new reactors like this? There's a lot of regulation that you kind of have to get through with the NRC to be able to even get these new designs, in production at all.
Yeah,
So super interesting that
yeah.
the TerraPower is kind of at that point. It sounds like.
Yeah, yeah, and I'll say like the regulatory stuff is a challenge for sure, but it's not even the majority. Like the hard part is the technology, like just building
Right.
a valve that can reliably open and close at 500 degrees Celsius sodium liquid metal temperatures. That's a technical challenge, and they don't make those off the shelf. And so building that supply chain and testing it and making sure it has the reliability, that kind of thing is the vast majority of the challenge. Making sure you do it under the quality assurance regulations is certainly something that has to be considered, but it's like kind of it's not the majority of the challenge.
Hmm.
So
Well, yeah, I'll be excited to kind of dive into
yeah,
that a
yeah.
little bit more as we talk through, the safety and
Mhm.
costs and all of that sort of stuff here in a little bit. I'm curious though. So, you've got you're a thought leader, I would consider in the space. You've got a
Thanks.
pretty good X following. You definitely got your finger on the pulse of
Mhm.
kind of where the space is right now, and you have for a long time. So I'm curious if you could just kind of put this moment in history into perspective to it for us. As far as nuclear energy goes, has there been another time when there's been this much like private investment and positive sentiment in the space? I mean, just from what you've seen from the amount of time you've been involved, kind of where are we here?
Private investment, I would say no. This is a new thing. Like the amount of private investment we're seeing in nuclear, both in fission, which is what we've been doing forever, and also fusion, which we haven't gotten to work yet, but there's a just unbelievable amount of private investment in that as well.
Hmm.
I don't think we've seen this level of private investment. I think this is fair to say, especially in um, advanced or like less developed types of reactors, more experimental types of reactors has not been something the private industry has put too much into. I will say, like, in the early days, the nuclear industry was much, much bigger in 1950 and 60 than it is today.
Sure.
Like,
Yeah.
just dramatically bigger. It's unbelievable. I love reactor history. And the more I read about what we
Hmm.
did back then, the more I'm just like blown away. A lot of that was government driven, but I mean, like when General Electric and Westinghouse started building the fleet of reactors that we have running today, they did put in a ton of money, and the utility companies also put in a ton of money. And I think it probably was more back then than we are seeing today, inflation adjusted, just because
Hmm.
it was bigger and they built, a whole fleet and they were bringing in groups of 10 utilities to build a reactor at Yankee Row or whatever. So, yeah, I think like but and back then the government was like doing all the advanced technology development. Like the government would develop a new type of reactor and be like, okay, this reactor is ready to go. We've got a demo of it. We built a small one. We built a prototype. And who wants to commercialize it? And then the private companies would come and build them in large scale privately. Now what we're seeing is like private investors are developing the the advanced reactors, like they're doing the technology development often in partnership with government at the national labs to try to build the first reactor, maybe at a national lab in Idaho or something like that. But yeah, it's kind of interesting that the tech investors are kind of leading the drive for some of the most advanced technological improvements right now.
I'm curious. So there's obviously all sorts of factors that are kind of spurring on this renewed interest in nuclear
Yeah,
and more attention on it and everything.
yeah.
I feel like one of them that I continually hear about is China and the progress that China is making in this same field. I'm curious, what are you seeing? What role does China play in this movement happening in America?
I think it is a major player. It's a major role. I was at a tech investor um, conference at Mar-a-Lago actually a couple months ago.
I saw this
Just
one.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It just was an interesting venue. And like I was sitting around a table with a bunch of investors, mostly from like family offices, and they were focused on, they were like, I can't believe what China is doing. Like we're absolutely, falling behind. And the more people hear about what China's actually doing in nuclear, the more urgent it becomes. I mean, they are so, people say like we're falling behind. Like we're so far behind already. It's like hard to describe. And I can go through some of the stuff that China's doing right now. But that's, I think, is a major factor. Like that's a big part of like why there's some political will to focus on it. I mean, there's numerous things like nuclear. People like nuclear for different reasons, and one of them, I'd say it's probably like a quarter or a third, is like competition internationally. But there's a lot of other factors in there as well. But yeah, if you'd like to hear some things about what China's up to right now, it's kind of shocking.
Yeah, just kind of give us the high level without going
Okay.
into a
Yeah.
ton of I'm sure you could talk for hours just about that
Yeah.
single topic, but just kind of give us
Well,
the
like,
overview.
so just a couple things to highlight. One is that they just have sort of built and turned on the world's biggest tower crane. It's like the craziest thing I've ever seen. It's this tower crane on like massive crawlers, and it's designed just to make huge light water nuclear power plants. And it can just like pound them. I can do the heaviest lifts I've ever seen. And it's just like a crazy crane. So the biggest thing they're doing is they're just building dozens and dozens of large light water reactors, the kind that we built in our fleet, but they're taking the best of them and they're just building them everywhere, like in 6-packs. And they're pounding them out. They're building them very quickly. They're running very well. There's people my age who have built, 30 nuclear plants or something. It's really insane. So that's like the major thing they're doing. And then they're also developing all the advanced reactors as well. There's a type of reactor called a high temperature gas cooled reactor, which uses high temperature helium gas as the coolant instead of water or sodium. Well, they built a little test one, and they got it going and it worked okay. And then next thing you know, they have 2 6-packs of these things being built side by side, and they're like they're mostly, I mean, they're under construction right now with like significant process. They took that one and they put 6 of them inside one concrete building, and then right next to it there's another building just like that with 6 more of them inside, and they have some shared infrastructure, shared fuel handling and a couple other things, but they're just like they're just building 12 of these things right away. And then another major thing that just was confirmed that they've been doing for a while is they've turned on a full-on thorium molten salt reactor, a small experimental one, similar to one that we built in Tennessee in the 60s. But it's a very popular type of reactor. A lot of people love the thorium molten salt reactor concept. And we've got a few efforts in the US to try to get towards building one. Well, they built one and they turned it on in 2023 and it's got a little bit of thorium in it and it's up and running. So like, that's just another thing. They're like really pushing the envelope. They've already built and are operating several different types of sodium. Oh, and then the sodium cooled fast reactors, we've been trying to rebuild some for the US. They just built 2 giant ones with the help of Russia, 2 big 600 megawatt ones. So they basically have up and running all the exotic and advanced types of reactors, plus they're building dozens of the like fully optimized, very modern large light water reactors that are like the workhorses. So it's astounding. Like it's not even close. Like we are super behind from China right now.
Yeah, I guess when you think of the undertaking required to build massive infrastructure projects like this, I mean, it does help to have kind of a centralized, government like they do. Like it does allow them to undertake these massive projects and make massive, progress on them very quickly, it seems like, which
Yeah,
it's
it's a little awkward. It's like, these centrally planned, like, oh, when France did it, when Korea did it, and when China's doing it in Russia, there is a lot of like central planning that like makes, if nuclear builds go well, it seems that there's some central planning involved, and that's not always the case. We built a big fleet in the U.S. without that, but I mean, it wasn't great, and there is a lot of like first of a kinds, and we didn't really learn in fleet mode, and so I don't know. Can a like modern democracy standardize? Like we could choose a standard plant and sort of all go in a partnership and do it if we wanted, but so far we just haven't. The motivation isn't quite there for that. Everybody kind of wants to have their own special thing. So yeah, it's a bit awkward, but yeah, it's kind of true.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I feel like the competition is probably what's needed, honestly, to just like get everyone moving in the same direction to some extent. And from my perspective, I feel like it all kind of ties back to geopolitics and power. And we're at this kind of interesting moment in history right now where like AI has added a whole different dimension to just like the geopolitical equation. Yeah. Now we're competing to try and maintain dominance in this space, try to be first to like AGI. Really what we've built with AI is like we're able to directly convert energy into intelligence. Yeah. And that intelligence is essentially what's going to, either usher in this era of abundance or cause a lot of conflict.
Yeah.
And that I feel like is kind of what is the meta thing kind of happening with, we really need to bring on as much power as possible, not only for AI, there's also manufacturing and electrification and economic growth, all of that.
Yeah.
But I really feel like it's something that America needs to kind of have that competition to get everyone to rally around one thing, because it's been a while, I feel like, since Americans have kind of all been on the same page of like, we need to accomplish this singular goal.
Totally.
And I hope this moment kind of coalesces into that shared goal as a country. I think that's kind of necessary.
Get that national identity back so that we can all just kind of roll up our sleeves and like get some power plants out the door. Yeah, I agree. I do hope that happens.
Yeah. So I'd love for you to just give us a brief history lesson on kind of what went wrong with nuclear in the past. So you mentioned like 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
It was like this moment in time when we discovered this new technology and everyone was like, oh my God, the future is going to be incredible. And then things started going wrong here and there. And now it's become very important to really need to educate people on the facts around nuclear because of that. So if you could just kind of give us that history lesson of what happened at the high level. I know that's a big question, but we can kind of dig into different pieces.
Yeah, just let me know where you want to go deeper. Yeah, I wrote up a like reactor development history thing on what is nuclear a couple of years ago, and it has one of those like reading time things on it. It says it's an 88-minute read. I'm like, oh gee, I wrote too much.
But novella.
Yeah, but I can summarize it. So yeah, the world was introduced to nuclear energy through atomic bombs, which was kind of which sort of ended the war, and it was announced as like, we've harnessed the fundamental power of the universe, and here it is. We very quickly wanted to turn that into commercial power, but it was like it was way too expensive. It was nowhere near economical against the major fossil fuel, which would be coal at that time. But it was economical for things that would also give, besides nuclear bombs, other like incredible military advantages. And where that happens, obviously, maybe is in submarines. So if you can now put, a million times more energy than you could with diesel fuel into a small area. Well, you could turn that into an engine for a submarine and make it a completely different. It wasn't like a different submarine. It was like a transformationally different machine. Like there was no such thing as a real submarine back then. Diesel submarines had a snorkel to bring in oxygen. They had exhaust. They could like not really go underwater. But a nuclear powered submarine is a true submarine. It can go underwater for like a year at a time. The only limit is how much food you can bring on board, unless you can bring fish in. They can make their own fresh water. So anyway, Captain Hyman Rickover, developed the nuclear-powered submarine in a crash program in the early 1950s. And that was the first like real high-power power plant that was successfully made from nuclear. And that was, the Nautilus launched and it went under the North Pole. And it was really like truly amazing. It was like it's also like a super weapon compared to anything else at that time. So that was like the first real non-weapons non-explosive application of nuclear technology. So then the U.S. Congress was like other countries had gotten nuclear power at this time. The UK was making electricity with their plutonium production reactors, and so was the Soviet Union. So now there were two other countries, back to competition, making grid-scale electricity with nuclear reactors. And the United States was like, dang it, we're falling behind. We had the lead on this. This is like right around Sputnik was happening soon after this. So the Congress really wanted to get commercial power up and running. So they funded a bunch of programs to develop all sorts of different types of nuclear reactors, hoping to find one that would be cheap, easy to run, reliable, easy to build, and so on. So we went off and we built just dozens upon dozens of very interesting and exotic reactors. Like you name it. I mean, we had organic cooled reactors that had like an oil or like a wax for coolant. We had gas cooled. We had fluid fuel, aqueous, homogeneous. We had liquid metal plutonium, eutectic with iron fueled reactors. Like really, there's an incredible list of reactors, and scientists kept coming up with like, hey, this one will be cheap, that one will be cheap. And we built them and they weren't cheap. They like operated very poorly. They broke all the time. They melted fuel. They leaked radiation. It was a disaster. Well, eventually, like Rickover's reactor that he made for the submarine turned out to be pretty reliable, pretty compact, and it used water as coolant, which is like pretty, everybody knows about water. And so eventually, like Rickover built a commercial scale power plant prototype at this plant called Shippingport in Pennsylvania. And they didn't think it was going to be economical long term because back then we didn't think there was a whole lot of uranium on Earth. And so they really thought they needed these breeder reactors that I was referring to earlier. But it turned out every time we looked for uranium, we found tons of uranium. There's like way more uranium than we imagined. And so fuel costs didn't really go that high. And it kind of made sense to just build the reactors like Rickover had made for the submarine at larger scale, scale them up, build them and run them as power plants. And that thing he built at Shippingport, which was still more expensive than a coal plant, operated beautifully. It like really was reliable, and all the other types were just not working that well. So, so the utilities got together and they were like, we think we can make this economical. And they took the Shippingport design. They took the same team who built Shippingport and they built the first like commercial light water cooled reactor. And that thing at Yankee Row, and that thing worked great. And so like that was kind of the start. And then, like, just fast forwarding through a bunch of detail, like, people kept trying to build lots of different types of reactors, sodium graphite reactors, sodium deuterium reactors, again, molten salt, you name it. But inevitably, they all failed for technical reasons. They all didn't work. They had leaks. They mixed sodium with the graphite, whatever. And the water cooled reactors work great. Like and so the water cooled reactors beat out the advanced reactors on a technical basis. They performed better. They were more reliable. They were easier to maintain. And then at that point, the utilities came in. We're like, well, we'll take a dozen of them. And they started ordering larger and larger water cooled reactors. And we built this fleet. And it now makes, to this day, our fleet of water cooled reactors makes about 20% of the country's electricity. Well, and then we kept making them bigger and bigger to make them cheaper and cheaper. Well, things started happening. Like we realized once we had 10 or 20 of these things up and running, there were different studies done that showed there might be like a safety concern. Like if this happens, if the power goes out and the pump stops, you could release radiation. And there were different reports of like how much radiation would come out, and there was a lot of uncertainty. Meanwhile, we were doing major nuclear weapons testing in the Pacific and in the Nevada test site, and people got concerned about radiation and fallout from that. Like there's fallout that you can detect in every high school, in your science class coming in from these nuclear weapons tests, and people are like, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't be spewing radiation all over the place. So there's this like big anti-nuclear movement that grew because of nuclear weapons. Well, that easily translated over to like if you say like no nukes, and you're talking about weapons, it's very easy to translate that into like no nuclear reactors either. Like you don't have to change the slogan. And there were a few safety issues and concerns that happened at the plants. I mean, everyone's heard of 3 Mile Island. That one's an HBO series. And later on, Chernobyl occurred in the, in 1986. There were some incidents before that, lesser known things where like the control rods didn't go all the way in. Or there was a big fire at one plant where like all the cables, the control cables caught on fire and the insulation melted and they all connected together and shorted everything out and they lost control of the plant and couldn't shut it down. Like that was not good.
Oh, Lord.
And so all those things led to more regulation. Like people were like, okay, well, you should have regulations that say you should not have flammable insulation on your cables and you should have 2 redundant sets of cables coming in. And so we're getting into like the regulatory ratchet. Each of these regulations came from an event, like a kind of scary event where the reactor almost, got into trouble. So, and that just went on and on for years. And meanwhile, I mean, yeah, nuclear just got unpopular. Again, started out as weapons, but it did just translate over. Like electricity demand stopped going up. We didn't need as much electricity through the 70s. There was the oil crisis and so on. Like it all flattened out. The environmentalist movement came and fought against all sorts of things. Any big industrial coal plants got the Clean Air Act because they were acid raining the heck out of the environment. Nuclear plants got the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, all the regulations. And yeah, it just became like totally uncool to like nuclear, to the point that there were then huge rallies, with all the famous musicians singing against anti-nuclear stuff. There's some great anti-nuclear music from the 80s, like really good songs. Um, but yeah, so I mean, the plants with all the regulations, they got more expensive. We did retrofits. Like we would go in and say like, okay, well, like in California, there was a plant that was just had like a dome containment, and they did some analysis that said in an accident, there would be so much radiation shooting out through that dome that it would like kill people if they were outside the plant. And so they were like, well, let's just build a second containment vessel around it. This is at San Onofre Unit 1. And so that was, they did it and it could continue operating safely, but it was expensive. And so there were lots of different retrofits like that. The new plants that came online had to have additional redundancy, additional quality assurance, and they just got more and more expensive. Also, inflation was going up. There were labor issues. There were strikes, like all sorts of delays. Interest rates went up so that a capital intensive build, like of a big capital intense nuclear plant, just becomes crazy expensive. The licensing delays, if you get delayed by 2 years, but you're paying interest on the construction loan, like that ends up being super expensive. So the financing became really expensive. And yeah, just overall, it's amazing the fleet survived it all. One thing, like with all those costs going up, but it happened to coal too. Like again, with Clean Air Act, they had to install scrubbers and bag houses and all sorts of stuff, which was much more expensive. And oh, the other thing that happened with the nuclear plants is we got much better at running them. So like even in the 70s, they were only online just over 50% of the time. The other fraction they were down for maintenance. But by 1990, they were up into the 90% range. So we just got so good at like, and this could be because we had more regulations and better quality assurance. Like they didn't break down as much and we got really good at running them. And so that kind of offset some of the cost increases to the point that like the fleet still survived and was still running. So anyway, that's a lot, but that kind of summarizes. What did I miss? What do you want to hear more about?
No, I think that's all really good.
Yeah.
One of the ways that I learned a lot about kind of the history of nuclear and kind of what happened to the space was through Packy McCormick's Age of Miracles series that he did. That I thought that was a great one.
Yeah,
It talked a lot about just some of these disasters that happened. If you might not even want to necessarily call it a disaster as opposed to just like an accident, that we were able to mitigate the damages pretty well. Like 3 Mile Island, I believe it's the radiation that escaped the plant was negligible as I understand it.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of how I understand what happened is, at least this, I don't know if this is a factual claim, maybe you can correct me on it or not, but the oil and gas companies saw nuclear as a big threat to their businesses, and there's some fear mongering that kind of happened. And then you kind of have this era where nuclear is kind of demonized. It sounds like both through the movements of no nukes that transferred over to nuclear energy, and then also probably layered on top of that, just more fear than was necessary around some of the accidents that happened. And now that kind of leads to, I feel like, the current state of how people understand nuclear. One, if they even understand nuclear. Yeah. I remember when I first started learning about it, I didn't know the difference between fusion and fission. Like, I think the normal person does not understand hardly anything about nuclear.
Right. They never think about, the average person does not think about nuclear at all. That's something I've learned. It's like, what do you think about nuclear? They're like, I don't. That's
yeah, exactly.
Like, I got stuff to do. Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely some truth to that. That like people leaned in on fear of radiation and like studies of like how bad is low dose radiation. Everybody knows that high dose radiation is very bad. Like high dose radiation is deadly. But there's this huge debate about low dose, very low dose radiation. Radiation is weird because you can detect even a single atom decaying, which is like, I don't know, 100,000 times too low of a concentration to cause any damage. So it's weird that you can like detect it. You can be like, well, there's radiation here, but it's at a level that is not dangerous. Like that's a hard story, and it's hard for like humans to understand that. And there is also a lot of scientific debate. Like we've gone back and forth on like, does low dose radiation cause an increase in cancer rate or not? Or like what dose rate is it that it starts causing that? And that has led to like all sorts of widely differing claims. Like the plume of radiation after Chernobyl certainly was detectable everywhere, and like Greenpeace will say it killed 4 million people, but the UN scientists who studied it say it killed 60 people. So like, which is it? There's like wildly different assumptions going on there. So still to this day, like the general practice, and it is kind of backed by science, is this linear no threshold model where like even, any radiation will cause some amount of damage, even if it's very low. No, like if it's below background, I have a Geiger counter right over there, and if I turn it on in this room, it clicks because of cosmic rays and radon and all sorts of stuff. So like we live and we evolved in a world where there was natural radiation. So like I kind of say, as long as the dose rate is way less than natural background, I'm just like not worried at all about it. But there are people out there who will see like a little tritium leak out of a reactor that's like a millionth of or a 10,000th of natural background, and they'll like freak out and protest about it. And that definitely causes problems. Um, Oil and gas, like, yeah, there was definitely time, like there's certainly testimony that I've read from the 60s where the coal companies are like, okay, the nuclear industry just said they're commercially viable, and so you don't need to pay to develop nuclear power anymore. Like they weren't saying we don't like nuclear or like we don't want nuclear or nuclear is bad. They were saying we don't think the government should pay for more development in nuclear if it's already reached the levels. We think it should compete with us on its own 2 feet. And so that was like
that makes sense.
that,
Yeah,
yeah, which,
makes sense.
yeah, who can argue with that? That one, it's like not overtly like bad, but it's just like a natural competition. But there were certain things like this guy named Rod Adams, who has a podcast called and a website called Atomic Insights. He has a whole section on his website called Smoking Gun Series, and he like tracks things from oil and gas that like spread fear about low dose radiation. Is kind of interesting. So there certainly is, and I've read through some of those things. I'm like, okay, he's got a point there. There definitely was fear mongering. But yeah, and then
Yep.
and the accidents, like 3 Mile Island was a bad accident. Like it did melt a lot of fuel in that reactor, and but in terms of like the total health effect of it, it was not bad. Like it didn't. The radiation released is very unlikely to cause significant damage to like anybody. And that's pretty widely agreed upon. But like there were a lot of safety systems that did work. Like it had a containment and like it largely contained the radiation. The radiation levels in the plant were very dangerous. And then Chernobyl, which was a pretty flawed reactor design, but just kind of emphasizes you can't just go out building whatever reactor you want. You have to like think about it. You have to have some understanding of stability. That was a very bad accident that did kill, certainly the first responders, and it released a huge amount of radiation, really, that people go back and forth on how many cancer deaths, but a number the UN used to say, but doesn't say anymore, was like maybe 4,000 early deaths from cancer, throughout lifetimes. But they don't even say that anymore because it's like the science is too uncertain. And then, I mean, in Fukushima, is similar to TMI, terrible accident. I mean, but again, the containment structures worked really well, and not that much. Some radiation was released, but not enough that's going to cause widespread harm. And when you're comparing that against like fossil fuel and biofuel combustion, which kills 8 million people per year from air pollution from particulates that cause lung disease and heart disease, well, like maybe one person over a lifetime from Fukushima is like not comparable to the health hazards of particulate emitting things like coal and oil and biofuel. So anyway, that's kind of,
Yeah,
that's where it ends up.
I think people, I think it's just a misunderstanding or not enough knowledge around radiation. It sounds like even the scientific community can't come to a consensus on what low dose radiation is,
It's super
where
hard.
it should fall in terms of how concerned we are about it. And
Yeah.
so I think that kind of leads us into another topic that a lot of people have concerns about around nuclear, and that's just what to do with the waste.
Yeah.
You have this kind of long-term waste that you need to figure out something to do with it. It's radioactive.
Yeah.
So it's, I guess just give us kind of level set where we are in terms of being able to deal with that waste. Do we have a pretty good solution? Is there a possibility of finding like a great solution? I mean,
Yeah.
tell us
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah, so we have several great solutions, and we just can't agree on which one to go do. And some places can't agree. So there's a great example right now, new information in Finland. Finland, they all get along with each other. They're the world's happiest country. They have nuclear power plants, and they built a nuclear waste repository that is going to get its license soon. Like it's under licensing right now, and it's very likely to get its operation license like I don't know exactly when, but very soon. So they went ahead and they built, it's called a deep geologic repository. They dug 500 meters into stable bedrock, and you package the nuclear fuel assemblies into basically big hopper cans, and you place them into this stable geologic formation. Well, that stable geologic formation we know a lot about it. We know it's been sitting around for millions of years. We know moisture does not move through it, and we know that radiation, this material has some energy in it that comes out slowly, and it can take 10,000 or 100,000 years for all that energy to come out. And if you like eat that stuff before the energy comes out, well, then you can get dosed with the radiation. So you don't want to eat or drink it before 10,000 or 100,000 years. So if you put it down in those rocks, it's like totally out of the biosphere. It's very likely that it's not ever going to cause anything or anyone or anything in the future. And it's like pretty much a consensus solution. Like all the geologists of the world are like, yep, if you put it in there, it's not going to hurt anybody. And like, we're very confident in that. There are similar type facilities. We have something like that in the United States. We're going to build one at Yucca Mountain. That became a political football for various reasons. We do have another thing called WIP, the Waste Isolation Pilot Project plant, which is a massive salt formation. And like you can like tell that moisture's only moved like a centimeter in the last 6 million years or something like that. So if you place it in this salt structure, the salt kind of like collapses back down on it, and it's like guaranteed to be safely isolated there again for like millions of years when you only need 10,000. The thing with Yucca Mountain, like the U.S. government was responsible. It was like, okay, we'll take nuclear waste, we'll deal with it. We'll take it from all the plants and we'll deal with it. Well, and they were choosing sites, and they chose a site in Kansas originally, but it turned out that was like not an appropriate site geologically. That was like a big embarrassment for the government. Then they chose Yucca Mountain because the senator from Nevada was like the least senior senator, and they were just like, we're going to send it to Nevada. Like, we don't care if you don't want it. Well, then, then later Harry Reid is the senator from Nevada, who's like the most powerful senator. And so he just shuts it down. And so Harry Reid, in the Obama administration basically got Yucca Mountain canceled once and for all. So like, we can do it. We know exactly how to do it. These geologic repositories are safe. Finland is proving it. They're moving ahead and doing it. We don't have one in sight. Like, we don't have a place for one. We have some efforts going on right now. There's something called the consensus-based siting program, where a bunch of people are talking. Like some friends of mine in the outreach community are going around and talking to communities in the United States, being like, hey, would you be, here's what would happen if you hosted a nuclear waste repository. Like, here's some benefits to the community. Like, there's a lot of money that comes in and jobs and so on. They're trying to, instead of say like, you get it, they're trying to say who wants it. And so that's kind of where we're at now. We certainly know what to do with it once we have a site. It's that siting that's the current hard part. So
do you have any, just a quick question off that. Do you have any like ballpark figures around like how much money, like, is it an economic development thing? How much money comes in? What's kind of the pitch to communities? Because I can only imagine going to community and saying, yeah, we want to store nuclear waste.
Some nuclear waste. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, that's got to be such a...
No, that's a great question. I don't know the exact shtick in terms of like how much economic development. I do know that like a waste repository, like Yucca Mountain, we spent about $10 billion just on that site. So, and there's currently about $55 billion in this thing called the Nuclear Waste Fund, which is like a trust fund. Whenever you buy nuclear electricity, 1 mil per kilowatt hour went into this fund. And so to pay for nuclear waste later. So it's prepaid. Like, we already have, and it's accruing interest, so we have this massive amount of money like ready to solve nuclear waste, way more than we need. And so that money will be used to, do whatever the repository ends up being. But like, how much exactly goes to the community versus like into the actual development of the repository, I'm not 100% sure. But yeah, I mean, I think it is like a pretty big development. Like, you get like hundreds or thousands of workers who are going to come in there to construct the thing. Lots of operational staff. And And the risk is, I mean, I think there's a really strong argument about the risk being low. I don't know if you've seen these films, like in terms of shipping nuclear waste, they have these canisters that we've built, and we've done tests of them where we stick a nuclear waste canister on like a truck and drive it at 80 miles an hour into a brick wall. And then we take that same thing and lift it up and drop it on a spike. And then we burn it in jet fuel for 90 minutes. And then we set it on a stalled truck and hit it with a rocket powered train. Like there's great YouTube videos of all this. And
Yeah.
like they don't leak, they don't lose their shielding of radiation. They're very robust containers, and like they're actually going to start doing more of these tests again, just to like continue proving that we can ship this stuff around safely. It is like shipping it around safely. I think there's a very strong case to be made, and again, like preventing it from leaking out. It's the form of it is like ceramic. It's like a uranium oxide. It's not the liquid vats of goo from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or whatever.
Yeah, The Simpsons or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. So like it doesn't really leak. So anyway, I think there's a pretty solid safety case to be made, and so the economic case and development case would be like the pro side on it. So, and that's
Interesting.
we'll see what the communities have to say about that. And okay,
Yeah.
so that's throwing it in the dirt, which people don't like, but we store all like we put tons of various types of waste like in landfills. Like this is and the amount of waste from nuclear power is so tiny. Like this is one of these things about nuclear power is that you can get your entire lifetime supply of primary energy from nuclear, and it's only going to fill up like a Coke can of nuclear waste for you. And that's like literally a millionth of how much waste you're making if you're using any other energy source. So
Right.
like the overall economic or the overall environmental and waste impact is as low as it can possibly be using nuclear. It's pretty concentrated, hazardous stuff, but because it's so small, it's practical to just put it all into like one mined facility, which is like pretty good trade-off. It's like you get zero pollution, no carbon electricity with like very little land impact, very little mining, and all you have to do is store like one little mine of the waste, and it's going to be down there for millions of years. Like it's not perfect, but it's not bad. Well, and then the other thing you can do, a lot of people argue, is like you should recycle the waste, and that's a whole other thing that's an option. I can talk about it if you want.
Yeah, I have been seeing some stuff about that. So I
Yeah.
guess just briefly, like how does that work? How do you recycle nuclear waste? That seems like something that shouldn't be recyclable.
Yeah, so it kind of comes back to this idea of the breeder reactor again. Like when we put nuclear fuel assembly in a typical reactor today and we split a bunch of atoms, we don't split all of the uranium atoms. In fact, we only split about 5%. And well, if you look at how much of the atoms we dug up out of the ground, we only split like 1% of the uranium atoms that we dig up out of the ground in current generation reactors. A big chunk of those are sitting outside the enrichment plant. When we enrich uranium, there's halines that have a bunch of uranium 238 atoms in it. But anyway, so like you just haven't gotten all the energy out. And so you can take that nuclear waste and put it in, you can melt it back down. Now you have liquid waste, so now you're into The Simpsons. But you can melt it down and you can separate it out into its constituents. Like 95% of it is uranium 238, which can be turned into fuel in a breeder reactor. So sorry, let me back up. There's two types of uranium in nature. And they're called isotopes. If you remember I think we talked about this in high school. But like the uranium 235 is 0.7% of uranium, and then uranium 238 is 99.3% of uranium out of the dirt. And so that just has, 3 more neutrons on it. Well, the minority, the 0.7%, U-235, that's the one that's good nuclear fuel. It splits readily and can maintain a chain reaction. But that uranium-238 it's not terrible nuclear fuel. All you have to do is invest 1 neutron in it, and then it becomes plutonium-239. It like 1 neutron in, it changes through a couple nuclear reactions and becomes plutonium-239. Well, if another neutron comes into plutonium, it splits just like that other one. So that's where this idea of breeding comes from. If you have some extra neutrons around, you can invest those neutrons in this otherwise unproductive uranium and make a huge amount of fuel. Again, it's 99.3% of natural uranium. We can convert all of it into plutonium and split it in reactors. But yeah, in order to do that, you have to recycle. You have to melt it down. Some of that stuff has become plutonium. So when you melt nuclear waste down, there's a small fraction of it that's plutonium. You can take that out, you can refabricate it into new fuel, and you can put it right back in a reactor. And in fact, like that's what France does today. They do that with all their waste. And so you can kind of keep doing that. And then if you make a reactor that has extra neutrons, which again, these like sodium cooled reactors have extra neutrons, then you can breed a lot more of that stuff into plutonium. So instead of just making 1% of your plutonium per run, you can pull out fuel that has 10%, that is 10% plutonium, and then you can fuel multiple reactors instead of just one. So it gets, in terms of like the value. So there's these quotes you'll hear like, well, if we took all the nuclear waste that we have today and put it in breeder reactors, we could run the whole country for like 300 years. And that's how much energy is in there. You could just stop mining uranium. You could stop mining gas, coal, turn off all the solar panels and just run on nuclear waste. Like it's more complicated than that. You have to start all these reactors up first before you can run on them. But like, it is true that there is that amount of energy sitting in that nuclear waste. So
are the infrastructure requirements mostly the reactors to get the other neutrons from, or would there be like a bunch of costs around building new infrastructure to handle like melting down the waste and doing all this stuff? I assume that's like a big investment.
Yeah, it's a huge investment. That's the short-term constraint. In fact, there's a sad story about, we tried to build a facility that could do about half of that process in South Carolina. It's called the MOX facility, mixed oxide. And it wasn't even going to take nuclear waste. It was just taking excess plutonium nuclear weapons and downblending that plutonium into reactor fuel so that instead of having bombs, you would power cities, which is like a cool story. But just that, the whole project boondoggled and it became like $10 billion and there was corruption and like we just canceled the whole thing. So we can't even build a fuel fabrication plant, much less a large scale reprocessing and fabrication plant, which is depressing. And I'm kind of embarrassed by it. Like what kind of nuclear industry can't even reprocess and refabricate spent fuel? Like again, France has this huge thing called La Hague that does this all the time. The UK had one at Sellafield, but I mean, there's problems with it as well. Cause like if you're melting down the waste, like it is going to leak a little bit and you are going to have radiation leaks. And in fact, historical reprocessing facilities did have problems. Like Hanford was basically a reprocessing facility. Like its purpose was to make weapons and they weren't focused on being clean about it because it wasn't a commercial operation. But like technically it was like an early stage reprocessing plant. So there is like an infrastructural challenge of like, if you do want to recycle, you have to take on the burden of like melting highly radioactive material and you have to be able to handle it and keep it around and not let it leak and all that kind of thing. So it's a lot to swallow.
Well, that brings up the kind of other issue around nuclear that is often cited, and that is just around the cost of building it and how to make it make sense for, you mentioned earlier, it's like the government put enough capital into developing nuclear that it was commercially viable.
Yeah.
And then the coal companies were like, okay, well, like now quit. You don't need to continue putting money into it. But it seems like is it still that? I guess the question is more so like what needs to happen to make nuclear energy attractive for investment? Like how do we make this make sense to, we've got the demand to build out the energy.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of an above all approach to it, but as far as nuclear is concerned, how do we make nuclear make sense from an investment perspective?
Yeah. I mean, a couple of things are happening, like just organically. One is that there's a bunch of microreactor companies now. So people are saying, well, if you can't afford a big reactor, why don't we sell you a little tiny reactor instead? And like, that's nice because it's a lot less money because it's a much, much smaller, a thousandth the power of a large scale reactor. But, and people are doing this. Like a couple of my friends are running microreactor companies now, which is, I think it's cool, but like, they're pretty limited to fringe applications. Like they work for like a military base, or it's kind of like Rickover submarines. You have to go somewhere where you can pay a lot more for electricity than like commercial. Like, right? We want cheap electricity, but these things make stupidly expensive electricity where the fuel alone costs more than natural gas full system electricity would cost. So microreactor, like some people think and they claim that, well, we'll build the reactor in a factory and so it'll be dirt cheap and then everything will be cheap. I don't buy it personally, again, because the fuel efficiency is very low for that kind of reactor. I think, and the fuel costs alone, as I just said, are too high. So, and then there's medium-sized reactors or small modular reactors, as we call them. That's the other effect. And again, I think it's just because big ones are like not cannot be financed. Like you can't finance another. We just built two big plants in Georgia, Plant Vogel Unit 3 and 4,
Hmm.
which
Hmm.
basically bankrupted Westinghouse, almost bankrupted Toshiba, the parent company of Westinghouse. And no one has the stomach financially to like take on that kind of risk. So now we're saying like, oh, just buy one of these medium-sized ones, which again, it's going to be higher cost per kilowatt hour, but lower total investment cost. That's one approach. I think that's a good way to like get the industry back rolling, especially if you can just find a few people willing to pay high for electricity for fringe applications. Um, but it doesn't really solve the real problem, which is like, how do you compete with natural gas? And
Hmm.
so that's, I mean, that's much harder. I mean, the thing that we've seen where it works is you like pick a standardized design that works well, like a proven out design that's reliable and can be built, is easy to maintain, and you build a bunch of them that look just like that. That's how France did it. Like France, they built 56 reactors in 15 years, and they did it like that. They had tried a bunch of different reactors, but they picked one that was good enough, and they built 56 of them. China's doing things kind of like that, but they've kind of chosen like three, and they're building dozens of, there's like three standard designs that they're building a lot of. Korea did that same thing where they basically bought a design from a bankrupt American reactor company called Combustion Engineering, and they like perfected it, and they just built a bunch of them. And Japan did the same thing. They standardized a reactor and they built a bunch of them. So that's like one obvious thing that we could do, but like we just so and like right now we just built two of these big, highly optimized AP1000 reactors in Vogel. They were crazy expensive. It was $30 billion for the two of them, which is way, way too high. But the second one was like 20% cheaper than the first one because, we had already figured out the flaws in the design. We got the license all figured out, and like the people knew exactly how to do it. And so there's a very high likelihood that the third one of those of that model would be even cheaper. And the fourth one, at that point you get down to the point where it's like looking pretty good. So
Mm.
like the Department of Energy put out a report a couple months ago called the Nuclear Energy Liftoff Report. And it basically said like, how do we get nuclear good again? And it basically said like, build more AP1000s, like find a way to do it. Like, I don't care, like get a consortium of people who are willing to take to take the risk, maybe backstop a loan with low cost federal money or something. Like that's kind of what the loan payments office at DOE was planning on doing. Um, but again, you're getting into like government subsidy at that point. But like that's the most likely way to like right now, just take the AP1000. Like we just built two of them. We know it works. We know we can license it and just try to build 10 more of them. And that's probably the best thing we can do. Um, Meanwhile, all these other people trying out to make reactors they think will be much cheaper, that should be explored, like for sure. And they should all have an opportunity to like build a prototype. One thing about nuclear that we learned in the early days is like, I don't care how good your PowerPoint slides are or how cool your thermal non-nuclear prototype is. You don't know a single thing about how well your reactor runs until you're running it with radiation, with all the systems in place at some meaningful scale. It doesn't have to be full scale, but like you need to be running a third size prototype with all the systems and all the radiation before you can say, oh yeah, this looks good. Like you really can't say, like there's so many examples of people who thought they had like the world's best reactor until they turned it on and it was terrible. So like,
Right.
um, so I'm like very supportive of like, let's build prototype reactors again and see, because like we've been talking about it so long and everyone's debating which one's better. It just doesn't matter. Like just build a few at small scale and see. But meanwhile, we shouldn't squander this opportunity to build the large light water reactors that are like pretty good, pretty optimized. So it's not the most satisfying answer because it's like you want some like savior technology to come in. Oh, let me just say one more thing on this, which is we did have a crazy project in the 70s and 80s where we were going to mass produce large light water reactors in a gigafactory. It was a ship-based platform. We bought it was called Offshore Power Systems. They bought an island in Jacksonville, Florida, They dredged it out. They installed the world's largest gantry crane. They got a license from the NRC to build 8 gigawatt scale pressurized water reactors on barges, like floating barges. So it was like, it kind of looks like a shipyard where like it was sized to build 4 of these reactors per year. You kind of like just move down the barged line and the cranes install different parts. And like, then you float off and you go off to your site, wherever that may be. And like they imagine having some sites were offshore. These are offshore nuclear power plants, which is kind of crazy.
Interesting.
But they also had an option where if you didn't want to run it offshore, you could just float it up to a land-based site and sort of build around, backfill a site. So embedding. But that's a really cool idea because then you get basically factory production, which was what the microreactor people want. But you also get the large economies of scale, so you can get good fuel efficiency, and you only, just like all the economies of scale plus economies of mass production. That's super interesting. The fact that we went so far to actually get a license from the NRC to build 8 of those is really incredible. We had tens of thousands of pages of environmental review and design documentation and everything. So that kind of an idea is pretty cool. And there's a few companies trying to revive that now. So I definitely like that idea as well.
Interesting. So, I mean, it sounds like the answer, if you kind of take it at the highest level, is building it like this fleet scale, like just replicating the same design. If we want to actually, like, what's the nearest term solution to scaling up nuclear and scaling up the amount of energy that we have on our grid? It's taking a few designs and just placing those everywhere. I assume that the government would probably need to subsidize that to be able to get it to the point where we have wide scale production.
I mean, yeah, that's basically the right answer if the reactors are big enough. I mean, I just don't think mass producing little tiny reactors, I don't see it as like, this is debatable. Like many people think that's the solution. I think you have to mass produce or serial produce pretty big reactors, good medium-sized reactors. But does it need government? I don't know. I mean, this thing with AI has been kind of interesting because like all of a sudden very wealthy tech companies have started saying like, we need reliable power now, and we're willing to pay a premium. Like we will pay extra if you can deliver it. And so like they're willing to pay a little bit more than market price as long as to have that capability where it's like reliable. A lot of them have climate pledges, so they want low carbon energy, which nuclear is very good at. And so like, could the tech companies form a consortium and buy the first 10 medium-sized standardized reactors? Like maybe, like that may not need much government subsidy at all. So like that kind of thing, I think would be ideal. And if there's that kind of demand, I think that would be really nice. If there were a reactor right now that we could confidently deliver for like 20% more expensive than natural gas, they would be buying them like crazy right now. They just aren't, because you can't believe what the nuclear industry says until they deliver. Like we've been saying, oh yeah, it's going to be cheap and easy for years, but every big project we do has been a boondoggle. So like we really need to get out there and demonstrate a non-boondoggle.
Sure.
And I think, but to get to a non-boondoggle, you got to go through a couple boondoggles. And so like we need to get over that hump. And so that's why I come back to the AP1000, where we're like halfway through the boondoggle. And so we should, instead of just saying like, no, let's go do another boondoggle over here, like let's lean in and get that boondoggle over the hump. So it is a truly good reactor design.
We don't have to spend a ton of time on this topic, but something that I've wondered just coming into the space and kind of learning, okay, there's essentially 2 different types of quote unquote nuclear energy. There's fission power and there's fusion. Yeah. Fusion is the one you mentioned at the beginning. Yeah. We haven't really proven that that's commercially viable. We've proven that we can at least initiate a fusion reaction that, produces more energy than it absorbs. But that's a big caveat. The lasers that actually produced it consumed more energy than was actually exactly emitted.
Yeah.
I guess my question is, with a lot of these reactors, a lot of these solutions you see predicting, okay, it's not going to be until the 2030s that we actually bring anything online. Is there a possibility in your mind, and this is completely, you can kind of be opinion based on, do you think we figure out commercial fusion in that amount of time? And then what happens with all of this progress that we made in fission? Does it even matter? Or does it just completely get leapfrogged?
Yeah, well, I just to briefly answer the question and loop back, like I don't think we'll have commercially viable fusion personally until like 2045 or beyond. That's kind of my current understanding. And that comes from I mean, it's this, the one you're talking about. If you draw a dotted line around like the little fuel target, then yeah, more energy came out than crossed that line.
Sure.
But then if you zoom
Yeah.
out, as you said, there's this massive warehouse full of lasers that used 400 times more energy than what crossed that line. So it's not
Yeah.
even close to real energy break even. That was called scientific break even. That's, BS break even. It was a good
Right.
milestone.
Yeah.
It was a milestone, but it's not, they aren't even close to making net energy. No one is. And so even if you can make net energy, you're nowhere near having a commercially viable power plant. So we made net energy with fission in 1942 under the squash court with Enrico Fermi. And it took us till 1965 to make a commercially viable power plant out of that energy source. So
Hmm.
the fusion people have a lot of milestones to go through. And certainly, I mean, again, there's just untold amounts. One company called Pacific Fusion just announced a couple of months ago a $900 million Series A raise. They're getting infinity money. So they have like unlimited funding, and maybe they will pull off like a miracle. And I think a lot of the investors are like hoping for a miracle because it's going to be cool, right? There's going to be Nobel Prizes and it's going to have this major implication. But just like the engineer in me, I started off in fusion, by the way. There's a lot of challenges. There's like material challenges. There's heat.
Mhm.
There's thermal to electric conversion challenges, breeding blanket fuel supply challenges. There's untold challenges. And like, I'm going to be excited when someone gets the Nobel Prize for making actual net energy. But I still think it's going to take 25 years to package that, or more, to package that into a commercially viable power plant. So I'd be happy to be wrong. It'd be fun to be wrong on this one. I would say, like, yeah, if someone comes up with like a magical fusion power device that's like tabletop and makes energy with no radiation or very little radiation and it's super cheap, then yeah, there's no point in doing fission or anything like that. That there will be no coal, no gas, no oil, no solar, no wind.
Sure.
Like
Yeah.
that'll just take
Solves
over
everything.
everything. But yeah, I mean, if someone does it with antimatter, same story. Like if John Galt comes in with his magic engine or whatever, like, yeah, it'll disrupt all the energy industries. But like, yeah, I mean, in fusion, you've got to have like the hottest thing on the planet. And if you're doing magnetic
Right.
confinement, you've got the coldest thing in the universe right next to it. And yeah, there's advances, like there's fancy materials and there's high temperature superconductors, but like, you take a high temperature superconductor and bash it with 14 MeV neutrons for, at high power, it's going to be like, what's going to happen to it? I don't know. So anyway, I'm a little skeptical.
Yeah.
I say
Sure.
2045.
Cool. Well, as we kind of wrap up the conversation here, the whole reason that I wanted to have this conversation in the first place with you, and the reason I've been following nuclear a little bit more closely is because Kentucky, where I'm from, has just established what they're calling the Kentucky Nuclear Energy Development Authority.
Sweet.
And so the stated purpose of that is basically just to communicate out to the nuclear ecosystem, hey, Kentucky is open for business.
Nice.
As far as nuclear energy is concerned. And so I guess the question is just, how should individual states think about positioning themselves to be able to benefit from the economic impact that nuclear can have? I mean, is it like each state should be considering building their own reactors? Should we be thinking of different states playing different roles in supply chains? What would be, your higher level view or opinion of that?
Well, that's a great question. And yeah, I'm so excited that you guys are setting that up. I'm happy to hear that. I mean, yeah, I think like getting your own reactor is probably the coolest thing that you can do. And it's not unreasonable. I mean, it's even like a research reactor at the state university could be fun. That used to be very common. We have fewer of those now, but those are good for like just training workforce. Like there's a major workforce issue. If we are going to expand nuclear, like we need people who can build at nuclear quality standards. Like we need welders and pipe fitters and just, skilled construction staff. So like trade schools is certainly one thing. Engineering schools is another. Building a reactor, I think it would definitely be the coolest thing. And these like prototype reactors that people need can be built anywhere. So, I mean, like Texas right now is trying to get a bunch of prototype reactors built in Texas, which is cool. So that could happen in Kentucky just as well. There have been plenty of, back in the 60s, we built some very interesting and exotic prototype reactors in like small town in Nebraska. Hallam, Nebraska got one, and a little town called Piqua, Ohio got an organic cooled prototype. Really historic and awesome reactor in, and it was in a relatively rural area, well, they didn't work. Neither of those worked that well, but they like pushed the envelope, and we learned a lot about nuclear. And so, yeah, just being part of like nuclear history or part of the nuclear endeavor by hosting a reactor is something that could be potentially interesting. And that's, yeah, I don't think there's much constraint. Unlike a state can definitely just be like, hey, we want a reactor. Like the NRC is going to help regulate it at the national level. So
Hmm.
that that would probably be the coolest thing to get going. But yeah, besides a reactor, all the other things, I mean, especially training supply chain is probably hugely impactful.
Yep. Now, at the beginning of it, I mentioned that I mentioned what is nuclear.com. You
Yeah.
mentioned on our call that you were hoping to kind of add some more components to that. Just as we kind of end here, I wanted to
Yeah.
give you a chance to tell people. I'm sure a lot of people are going to want to go check that out, that listen, and hopefully go down the same nuclear rabbit hole that I went down. But
Yeah.
just give us an overview of what you hope to turn that into, so that our listeners can follow along.
Sure. Yeah, I have a couple ideas and we'll see how they turn out. But, like one thing I'm just working on right now is like a different version of a reactor database that would sort of basically imagine like a map where you can with a timeline slider on it, and you can like slide it and see reactors pop up and disappear, and maybe change color when they like come to power. And that's just it's something I spend a lot of time like thinking about which reactor was which, and just having like a cool interface on a reactor map with maybe a crowdsourced database type thing on that would be kind of fun. That's one thing I was planning on working on. Another thing, I want to lean a little bit more on things that like directly help industry. Like it started out like purely public education. And so it has like, what about the waste? Like, what is a reactor? And then, what's the history and all that kind of thing. I want to do a little bit more on like, hey, you want to start a nuclear company? Here's some resources for you, like at that level. Well, these are like a little bit less exciting sounding, but are actually pretty important. So having something like a nuclear procedure set that could be sort of collaborated on, where
Hmm.
you can just have like your calc procedure and your procurement procedure and a couple other, some engineering design procedures that have a bunch of lessons embedded in them and have ties to the regulations. It's like, you have to do this because this regulation said so. Basically, let's make it easy to comply with the regulations so that if you want to start a nuclear company, whether it's a reactor company or a supplier for some equipment, and you want to comply with all these nuclear regulations, like I kind of want to make like a starter kit that's like, here you go. Like it's not that hard. It's a little complicated, but like here's the steps. I think that would be like a cool resource that's just not really out there on the internet right now. So that's
Yeah, very
that's
cool.
another kind of fun thing I want to do. I've been doing this like the history project where I've been getting films digitized, old historic reactor films. That's been a lot of fun. And I've got a bunch more of those in the queue. And I'm always looking for like sponsors. If anyone wants to sponsor the, just at cost digitization of an old nuclear film, get a hold of me. We've done like 25 of them, and they're all on there in like the history section. They're pretty awesome. And I just got like a box of, I've never even heard like U-matic video cassettes. They're like really big VHSs. I've never actually
Yeah,
like
yeah.
held one. They're from the 70s. I just got a box from an old professor. It's like, here you go. And I'm like, great. Now I have to like pay to get this digitized. But there's some, I mean, they sound cool. So yeah, more of those will definitely be coming out. And yeah, just hoping to kind of just build on that, and maybe, if people like it, turn it into some, I don't know, a consulting type business or something like that.
Right.
So that's the current target.
Very cool. Well, if anybody wants to follow along with Nick's work and his thought leadership, like I mentioned at the beginning, your X account at What Is Nuclear, great follow. So been following that for a while, and
Thanks.
yeah, and always enjoy the stuff that you post. So Nick, thanks
Love
so
it.
much for taking the time to hop on here and talk through all of this.
Yeah,
I'll continue to keep you posted as Kentucky tries to lean into, being open for business in nuclear. So yeah,
great.
thanks again for taking the time to come on.
Yeah, thanks, Logan. It was a great pleasure. Thanks for having me on. It was fun.